Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The dust tasted of rust and regret. Cale worked the parched soil of Ethel with hands that were more callous than skin, his movements economical, honed by years of coaxing life from a world that actively resisted it. Each turn of the hydrospade was a quiet rebellion against the planet's sterile indifference. The twin suns, one a bloated orange giant and the other a spiteful white dwarf, beat down on the corrugated iron roof of his hab unit, a relentless, two-tone depression. This was his peace, a self-imposed exile paid for in sweat and solitude. He had left the wars behind, traded the polished deck plates of a corporate destroyer for the grit of real earth beneath his fingernails. He was a farmer now. The title felt honest in a way Chief Warrant Officer never had. The colony's power grid flickered again, the third time since morning prayers. The hum of the atmospheric processor in his modest filtration unit faltered, sputtering like a dying lung before catching again with a whine of protest. Cale paused, leaning on his spade, and looked toward the horizon where the monolithic form of the terraforming reactor squatted against the bruised purple sky. It was a brutalist scar of concrete and steel, the heart of the Ethel colony, and it was failing. Everyone knew it, from the lowest hydroponics tech to the governor in his climate-controlled spire. They spoke of it in hushed tones in the settlement's mess hall, a shared anxiety that hung in the recycled air thicker than the ever-present dust. He had no interest in their problems. He had served his time, fulfilled his contract. He had earned his 10 acres of desolation and the right to be left alone. He drove the spade back into the unyielding ground, the rhythmic crunch a mantra against the encroaching concerns of the wider world. Let the governor and his decorated engineers handle it. They had the schematics, the degrees, the clean hands. He had a failing crop of soy protein and the ghosts of a dozen campaigns he was trying to bury, one shovelful at a time. The drone of an approaching skimmer broke the afternoon stillness. It was not the lumbering cargo hauler that brought monthly supplies, but the sleek, aggressive shape of a corporate security patrol. It cut through the thin air with an arrogant whine, leaving a plume of red dust in its wake. Cale did not look up. He continued his work, his posture unchanged, a silent denial of their existence. They would pass. They always did. But the whine deepened, slowing as it drew near. The shadow of the skimmer fell over him, a sudden, chilling eclipse. Cale stopped, his back rigid. He slowly straightened, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of a gritty glove. Two figures in the stark white and gray of the Ethel Corp security force disembarked. Their armor was sealed against the environment, their faces obscured by polarized blast shields. The lead figure held a data slate. The other kept a hand resting casually on the stock of a pulse rifle. "Kalen," the first one said, his voice a tinny rasp through the helmet's external speaker. It was not a question. Cale said nothing. He just watched them, his expression as barren as the landscape around him. "The governor requires your assistance. There is a critical issue with the primary reactor." "I'm a farmer," Cale stated, his voice low and rough from disuse. He let the words hang in the air, a simple, irrefutable fact. "Your service record indicates you were a Class 4 combat engineer," the security officer countered, tapping his slate. "Specialization in pre-unification fusion cores. The kind nobody knows how to service anymore. The kind that is currently threatening to turn this entire hemisphere into a sheet of glass." Cale's jaw tightened. His service record. A ghost he thought he had buried deep. He had hoped the bureaucracy had lost him, that he had become just another number on a forgotten manifest. Clearly, he had underestimated their diligence when their own survival was on the line. He looked from their impassive helmets to the failing reactor on the horizon. It was their problem. It was not his war to fight. "My contract is concluded," he said flatly. The second guard shifted his weight, the movement a subtle threat. The lead officer, a man Cale would later know as Commander Thorne, took a step forward. "This is not a contractual request, farmer. Governor Valerius has invoked the Colonial Preservation Act. Your expertise has been requisitioned. You will come with us." There was no room for negotiation in his tone. It was the same voice of command he had spent 15 years obeying, and another 5 learning to forget. He felt the old, bitter taste of compliance rise in his throat. He looked at his field, at the neat rows of struggling plants that represented his new life. Then he looked at the skimmer, a portal back to the world of orders and consequences. He had no choice. He never really had. He jammed the spade into the ground, a makeshift grave marker for his interrupted peace. Without another word, he walked past the guards and boarded the skimmer. The door hissed shut, sealing out the familiar scent of dust and sealing him into the sterile, recycled air of his past. The journey to the reactor complex was short and silent. Cale stared out the armored viewport at the passing landscape, a blur of red rock and canyons carved by winds that had blown for millennia before humanity had arrived. Inside the complex, the air was cold and carried the sharp, ozonic tang of stressed electronics. Alarms strobed in muted yellow, a sign of caution, not yet panic. Engineers and technicians scurried through the corridors, their faces etched with a professional anxiety that was quickly fraying at the edges. Thorn led him through the chaos, his boots echoing with an authority Cale found gratingly familiar. They stopped before a massive, circular blast door marked Primary Containment. Governor Valerius was waiting for them. He was a man who looked like he had been assembled from a kit of expensive parts. Impeccable suit, silvered hair, a face that was handsome in a severe, predatory way. He held himself with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never been told no. "This is him," Valerius asked Thorn, his eyes appraising Cale as if he were a piece of aging equipment. He dismissed Cale's dusty farm clothes with a faint sneer. "Calen, our last resort," Thorn confirmed. Valerius turned his full attention to Cale. "They tell me you know how to fix these old relics. The core is fluctuating unpredictably. My engineers, with all their simulations and theories, are useless. They are afraid to even get close. They say the radiation shielding is compromised." "It's not the shielding," Cale said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast chamber. He ran a hand over the cool metal of the blast door, feeling the faint, erratic vibrations through his palm. "The core is organic. You can't fix it with a diagnostic scan. You have to listen to it." A flicker of annoyance crossed the governor's face. "Organic? It is a machine. A fusion reactor. A biophotonic fusion core," Cale corrected him, not bothering to hide the weariness in his tone. "A technology they abandoned because it was too temperamental, too alive. You don't program it. You coax it." He pushed past them and began to unseal his old toolbox, which the guards had brought from his hab. The clicks of the latches were loud in the tense silence. "Get him whatever he needs," Valerius ordered, his voice tight. "Just get it done. The fate of this colony rests on this." Thorn escorted Cale into the observation room, a curved space with a thick plasteel window looking down into the reactor core chamber. The sight silenced him for a long moment. It was not the clean, humming heart of a machine he had expected. The chamber was a cathedral of conduits and magnetic coils, all centered on a shimmering, chaotic nexus of light contained within a crackling energy field. The light was the color of a deep sunset, shot through with veins of violent violet. It writhed and pulsed, lashing out at its containment field like a caged animal. This was the source of the colony's power. And it was beautiful, and it was in agony. "That is the specimen," Thorn said from behind him, the word dripping with disdain. "The company found it when they surveyed the planet. They built the reactor around it. Tamed it." Cale saw no taming. He saw torture. The energy field was not just containing the light. It was constricting it, siphoning its brilliance. The fluctuations, the power failures, they were not malfunctions. They were cries of pain. He realized with a sickening certainty that the specimen was a living being. He could feel its distress as a low thrum in the bones of his skull. "I need to go in there," Cale said, turning from the window. Thorn laughed, a short, ugly sound. "That's a negative. The rad counts are off the scale. We send in drones. They get fried before they're halfway to the core." "Drones can't feel what's wrong," Cale insisted, meeting the commander's hidden gaze. "This isn't a broken cog. It's a wound. I need to get close." He suited up in a heavy radiation suit, the familiar weight settling on his shoulders like an old sin. The engineers watched him with a mixture of awe and pity, as if he were a man walking to his own execution. As he cycled through the airlock, the low thrumming intensified, becoming a chorus of silent screaming in his mind. He ignored Thorn's final, clipped warning over the comms and stepped out onto the gantry that led to the core. The heat was immense, a dry, baking pressure that the suit's cooling system struggled to mitigate. The light from the core pulsed, washing the chamber in waves of orange and purple. As he drew closer, he could see her. Within the storm of energy, there was a form, vaguely humanoid, a silhouette of impossible grace made of pure light. Her limbs were stretched, her head thrown back in a silent scream that resonated with the reactor's failing hum. He ignored the readouts on his wrist display, the frantic warnings about energy spikes and radiation saturation. He opened his toolbox, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't looking at the machinery. He was looking at her. The engineers in the observation booth saw a grizzled farmer tinkering with a control conduit. They saw him bypass a primary regulator and manually adjust a feedback dampener. But Kale was not repairing a machine. He saw a feedback loop, a particularly vicious one, that was arcing directly into her side, causing her form to spasm violently with each pulse. It was a flaw in the system, designed to drain power but without any regard for the source. Acting on an impulse he did not understand, pity, empathy, a simple refusal to stand by and watch something suffer, he reached out with a calibrated wrench. He didn't cut the circuit. He just adjusted the flow, redirecting the worst of the energy feedback into a secondary heat sink. It was a tiny change, a detail the schematics would have overlooked, a compassionate tweak in a system built on brutal efficiency. The effect was instantaneous. The violent violet spasms ceased. The chaotic thrashing of the light softened. The being of light, Lyra, seemed to unclench. Her form coalesced, becoming more stable, the light shifting from a furious orange to a warm, golden glow. The silent screaming in his head subsided, replaced by a feeling of immense, exhausted relief. On the main control panel in the observation room, every status light suddenly flipped from red to green. The reactor's output, which had been dangerously fluctuating between 40 and 60%, spiked, stabilized, and locked solidly at 100%. The alarms cut out, plunging the complex into a profound silence broken only by the steady, healthy hum of a perfectly functioning core. The engineers stared at their consoles in disbelief. Thorne lowered his binoculars, his posture rigid with shock. Governor Valerius, who had been pacing like a caged predator, stopped and stared at the stable readouts. He looked through the plasteel window at the lone figure in the radiation suit standing calmly on the gantry. Kale walked back, the suit feeling heavier than ever. When he emerged from the decontamination chamber, stripping off the helmet, the entire control room was silent. Every eye was on him. Valerius approached, his earlier arrogance replaced by a look of grudging respect. He stopped before Kale, who stood there in his sweat-soaked undersuit, covered in grime. The suns were setting outside, casting long shadows across the colony. The dusk was settling. "Mr. Kalen," Valerius said, his voice quiet but clear. "My apologies. I underestimated you." He extended a hand. Kale ignored it. "You have saved this colony. What is your price?" "Leave me alone," Kale said. That was all he wanted. Valerius's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "As you wish." For now, he turned to his engineers. "I want to know exactly what he did. Replicate it. Stabilize it." But Kale knew they couldn't. They had seen a mechanical fix. He had performed an act of mercy. And in doing so, he had forged a connection. As he looked back at the observation window, he felt a flicker of awareness from the core, a gentle touch in his mind. It was a feeling of gratitude and of warning. His simple act had not just fixed the reactor. It had awakened its prisoner, and it had drawn the unblinking eye of her jailers directly upon him. The stability was a reprieve, not a solution. In the governor's eyes, Kale had not just proven the reactor could be fixed. He had proven its living component could be manipulated. A new, far more dangerous idea was taking root behind that cold, calculating gaze. The governor might have called him sir at dusk, but Kale knew that by dawn, he would be a target. The quiet life he had fought so hard to build was over. The true crisis had only just begun. They let him return to his farm, a temporary furlough born of the governor's confidence. For 2 days, Kale worked his land under the steady, unwavering light of a fully powered colony. The hum of his water purifier was strong and constant. The night was ablaze with lights from the settlement, a stark contrast to the flickering gloom of the week before. But there was no peace in it. He felt like a man on death row granted a last meal. He kept his tools clean and his senses sharp, He could still feel the faint connection to the core, a soft hum at the edge of his consciousness, a silent presence that was both a comfort and a constant reminder of his transgression. The skimmer returned on the third day, just as he knew it would. This time, Thorn did not bother with pleasantries. He brought 4 guards, their pulse rifles held at a low ready. "The governor requires your consultation again," Thorn said, his voice flat and devoid of any of the previous day's grudging respect. "We're implementing a permanent upgrade based on your unorthodox methods. Phase 2 of the extraction protocol. We need you to supervise." Kale knew what extraction protocol meant. It was a corporate euphemism for bleeding something dry. They were going to push her, hurt her, to see how much more power they could wring from her before she broke completely. His fix had shown them a new way to turn the screw. "I'm finished," Kale said, not turning from the fence post he was mending. "I did what you asked." "Your work is not finished until we say it is," Thorn snapped. "Now get on the skimmer." Kale slowly put down his hammer. He turned, his eyes hard. "No." It was a single word, but it hung in the air like a declaration of war. Thorn's posture stiffened. The guards raised their rifles. For a heartbeat, the desolate farm was a standoff, a microcosm of the conflict Kale had tried to flee. But he was one man with a hammer against an armed security squad. It was a fight he could not win. Not here. He allowed them to escort him, a prisoner in all but name. Back in the reactor complex, the atmosphere had changed. The anxious energy was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical purpose. New equipment had been brought into the observation room. Heavy-duty power conduits snaked across the floor toward a new console bristling with aggressive-looking controls. Valerius was there, overseeing the work like a proud scientist about to begin a vivisection. "Ah, Kalen," the governor said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Just in time. We're ready to implement a more assertive form of regulation. Your little trick with the feedback loop gave my science team some wonderful ideas." He gestured to the core, where new emitters had been positioned around the containment field. Kale felt a cold dread wash over him. He could feel her fear, a frantic, panicked thrumming that vibrated through the very floor. They were going to deliberately harm her. "You don't know what you're doing," Kale said, his voice barely a whisper. "You'll kill her. You'll destroy the core." "The specimen is a resource," Valerius replied coolly. "A remarkably resilient one. We are simply maximizing its output." He turned to a technician. "Begin the sequence." As the technician's fingers flew over the console, the new emitters began to glow with a menacing red light. Inside the core, Lyra's golden form recoiled. A wave of pure terror washed over Kale, so potent it made him stagger. He saw it then, the only path forward. It was not a choice. It was an imperative. He moved. Years of combat training, buried under layers of dirt and toil, took over. In one fluid motion, he lunged for a heavy fire suppression canister on the wall, wrenched it free, and slammed it into the side of the new control console. Sparks erupted. The technician cried out in alarm. The red glow from the emitters died instantly. "Seize him," Valerius roared, his composure shattering. Thorn and his guards converged on Kale. But in that moment of distraction, Kale was already moving again, not towards the exit, but towards the main containment control panel. He slammed his palm onto the emergency purge button, a feature designed to vent the containment field in case of a catastrophic failure. It was a protocol of last resort, one never meant to be used. A klaxon began to scream through the complex, its deafening shriek accompanied by flashing red lights. A massive hiss of escaping gas filled the air. On the other side of the plasteel window, the crackling energy field that held Lyra prisoner flickered, wavered, and then collapsed. For a split second, there was absolute silence. The light in the core, freed from its cage, expanded in a brilliant, silent explosion. It filled the chamber, a newborn star of pure gold. Thorn's men, momentarily blinded, raised their arms to shield their eyes. Kale used that second to his advantage. He kicked a security panel, shorting the magnetic locks on the observation room door, and sprinted into the corridor. He didn't look back. He could feel her presence, no longer a distant hum but a blazing sun right behind him. He ran, not from her, but with her. The exodus had begun. The corridors were chaos. Alarms blared, people shouted. Kale navigated the familiar layout of the service tunnels by instinct, his goal the maintenance exit on the far side of the complex. A torrent of golden light flowed behind him, not burning, not destroying, but moving with a liquid grace. It was Lyra, free but disoriented, her consciousness a maelstrom of confusion and newfound liberty. She clung to his presence, the one anchor in a world of harsh angles and solid matter she did not understand. They reached a junction. Cale skidded to a halt. Thorn and two of his guards stood at the end of the corridor, rifles raised, the beams from their targeting lasers cutting sharp red lines through the dusty air. There was no way past. "It's over, Kalen." Thorn's voice boomed over the alarms. "Surrender the asset." Cale stood his ground, placing himself between the soldiers and the brilliant light coalescing behind him. He had no weapon, no plan. He was just a man in a jumpsuit, a farmer standing against the fist of the corporation. The guards tensed, their fingers on the triggers. He felt a wave of cold resolve from Lyra. She sensed his imminent death. The golden light behind him intensified, and then it swept forward. It was not a blast of heat or energy, but a wave of pure kinetic force, accompanied by a deafening psychic scream that hit the guards like a physical blow. They cried out, clutching their helmets, and stumbled backward, their weapons clattering to the floor. Their rifles' energy cells overloaded with a cascade of blue sparks, rendered inert. The wave passed over Cale without touching him, a testament to the control she possessed even in her confusion. He seized the opportunity, grabbing her, or rather, the focal point of her light, and pulling her down a different passage. They came to a heavy-pressure door, a manual bulkhead that had rusted shut. She could phase through energy fields, but solid matter was an insurmountable obstacle for her. The light pulsed with frustration. "Here," Cale grunted, putting his shoulder to the heavy wheel lock. He strained, muscles screaming in protest. The metal groaned, flakes of rust falling to the floor. For a terrifying moment, it wouldn't budge. He could hear Thorn regrouping behind them. With a final, desperate heave, the lock gave way with a deafening screech. He shoved the heavy door open just enough for them to slip through and slammed it shut behind them, ramming the wheel back into its locked position. They were in a dark, narrow maintenance duct. He was panting, his heart hammering against his ribs. The golden light that was Lyra pulsed softly beside him, illuminating the cramped space. He felt a gentle touch in his mind, a feeling of concern, and a clear image, his own straining face, the raw effort he had just expended for her. It was the first time she had been saved by another. It was the first time he had fought for a cause that was not his own survival. In the echoing silence of the tunnels beneath the dying heart of the colony, an alliance was forged not in words, but in a shared act of mutual protection. They plunged deeper into the darkness, a disgraced soldier and a fugitive star, leaving the world of men and machines behind for the unknown desolation of the Ethel Badlands. The Badlands were a windswept hell of jagged rock and canyons filled with razor-sharp dust. The twin suns baked the landscape by day, and a profound, crystalline cold descended at night. Cale led them away from the colony, following ancient, dried-up riverbeds that offered the only concealment from the patrol skimmers he knew would be hunting them. He moved with the grim efficiency of a man long accustomed to harsh environments, rationing his energy, his senses on high alert. Lyra flowed beside him, a shimmering distortion in the air. In the open wilderness, her form was less cohesive, a swirling cloud of golden motes that seemed to struggle against the wind. She was powerful, but she was a creature of contained, stable energy. The chaotic, raw nature of the outside world was alien to her. The harsh sunlight seemed to diminish her brilliance, while the deep cold of night made her light pulse weakly. She was vulnerable in a way Cale had not anticipated. Their journey was a silent ordeal. Days were spent hiding in shallow caves or under rock overhangs, enduring the oppressive heat. Nights were for travel, moving under the cold light of Ethel's 3 moons. They did not speak, but their communication deepened. She would show him images in his mind, the sweeping aerial view of a skimmer patrol, allowing him to guide them into cover long before it appeared. The location of a hidden spring, a deep fissure in the rock where precious, brackish water collected. In return, he protected her from the physical world. He built shelters from the wind, his body shielding her weak light from the worst of the gusts. He learned to read the state of her energy by the color and intensity of her glow, knowing when she was weakening, when she was afraid. One evening, as they rested in the lee of a massive rock formation that looked like a skeletal hand, she showed him the truth. It came not as a lecture, but as a flood of memories, of sensations that were not his own. He saw Ethel not as a barren red rock, but as a vibrant world, humming with a life force he could not perceive. He felt the arrival of the first human ships, a sharp, metallic intrusion into the planet's silent song. He saw the discovery. He saw her, not as a single being, but as the focal point of that song, a sentient nexus of the planet's life energy. He saw the scientists, Valerius among them, younger and even more ambitious. He witnessed their awe turn to greed. He felt her confusion as they built their brutal machine around her, her curiosity turning to pain as they pierced her nexus with their siphons. He experienced the long, slow agony of her imprisonment, decades of her life force being drained away to power their cities, to warm their homes, to fuel the engines of the very corporation that held her captive. The reactor was not a cage built for a monster. It was a parasite, and she was its host. The colony's failing power was not a mechanical flaw. It was her life, finally guttering out after a century of torment. The revelation settled in Cale's gut like a block of ice. He was not just a saboteur who had freed a prisoner. He had stumbled into the heart of a monstrous injustice, a crime a century old. Valerius wasn't just a ruthless governor. He was a butcher, and the entire colony was built on the foundations of his atrocity. The knowledge gave his flight a new purpose. It was no longer about his own survival. It was about hers. He had a cause now, a concept he had long ago discarded as a naive luxury. A few nights later, they were tracked. A skimmer, flying low and fast, caught them in the open. Its searchlight pinned them against the canyon floor. Cale shoved Lyra towards a cluster of boulders, yelling, "Go! Hide!" A pulse round exploded against the rock near his head, showering him with searing fragments. One piece, sharp as a shard of glass, tore through the fabric of his jumpsuit and sliced a deep gash along his forearm. He cried out, stumbling, the pain white-hot and immediate. He scrambled behind the rocks, pressing a hand to the wound, blood welling up between his fingers. The skimmer hovered, Thorne's voice booming from its external speakers. "Nowhere left to run, farmer. Give her up, and the governor might let you live out your days in a labor camp." Lyra pulsed with a cold, terrifying fury. She was about to unleash another wave of energy, but Cale stopped her. He sent a feeling of his own through their bond, a firm negation, an attack like that would drain her dangerously, and Thorne would be prepared for it this time. It was a fight they had to survive, not win. He tore a strip of fabric from his sleeve and began to wrap his arm, hissing as the rough cloth bit into the wound. Lyra drew close, her light softening. She projected an image into his mind, his arm, the torn muscle, and severed veins. Then, she showed him a memory of her own, a swirling vortex of pain and darkness, and then a sharp, piercing agony. A deep, jagged wound in her own field of energy, a place where the light was thin and scarred. It was the moment the first siphon had been driven into her nexus. A permanent injury. A shared understanding of pain passed between them in that silent moment. He looked at the old, faded scar on his other hand, a puckered white line from a shrapnel wound he'd received on Cygnus X-1, a war he'd fought for a cause he no longer believed in. He had his scars. She had hers. They were both survivors of other people's wars. He finished tying the crude bandage and looked up at the hovering skimmer. He had to get them out of this. He noticed the canyon walls were unstable, riddled with fractures from millennia of seismic activity. An idea, desperate and dangerous, formed in his mind. He looked at Lyra, then at the cliff face above the skimmer. He sent her a clear image, a concentrated beam of kinetic force, not at the skimmer, but at a specific, precariously balanced rock overhang. She understood immediately. The golden light around her compressed into a tight, brilliant point. For a moment, she was a miniature sun, and then she fired a focused lance of pure force. It struck the cliff face with a silent, tremendous impact. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan that shook the canyon, the entire overhang fractured. Tons of rock and dust sheared away from the cliff and plunged downwards. Thorne screamed a curse over the skimmer's speakers. The pilot reacted instantly, throttling the engines to pull away. But it was too late. The avalanche of rocks slammed into the skimmer's tail section, crushing it. The vehicle spun out of control, smashing into the opposite canyon wall with a sickening crunch of metal and exploding in a blossom of orange flame. The sound of the explosion echoed through the Badlands, a funeral pyre for their pursuers. Cale and Lyra fled into the night, the light of the burning wreckage casting their long, fleeing shadows against the ancient stones. They had won the battle, but Cale knew the war was far from over. Valerius would not be so easily deterred. He would send more men, more machines. And he was growing desperate. A desperate man was the most dangerous animal of all. The destruction of Thorne's patrol bought them time, but it was a fleeting reprieve. They pushed deeper into the Badlands, into a region the colony's survey maps had marked as unstable geothermal zone. It was a landscape of steaming fissures and bubbling mud pots, the air thick with the smell of sulfur. Cale hoped the treacherous ground and distorted sensor readings would shield them from detection. But Valerius was no longer just hunting them. Back at the colony, deprived of his prize, the governor had grown reckless. Cale could feel it through his connection with Lyra, a new and terrible pain emanating from the distant reactor, a deep, grinding agony. In his frustration, Valerius had initiated a forced extraction, a brute force attempt to rip power from the wounded and severed nexus Lyra had left behind. The result was catastrophic. The reactor, already unstable, was pushed beyond its limits. Without its sentient heart to regulate the flow, the raw energy of the planet began to surge uncontrollably through the machine. The sky to the west, in the direction of the colony, began to glow with a sickly, pulsating red light. The ground beneath Cale's feet started to tremble, not with the localized tremors of the geothermal zone, but with a deep, rhythmic shudder that spoke of a power immense and untamed. A planetary fever. Lyra collapsed, her light dimming to a faint, flickering ember. She pulsed with agony, her pain a direct reflection of the torment being inflicted on her other half, the nexus still trapped within the failing machine. She showed Cale what was happening. Containment fields were overloading, conduits were melting. The very foundations of the reactor complex were beginning to vitrify under the unimaginable heat. The reactor was going critical. It was no longer a power source. It was a bomb with a planetary yield. Cale stared at the crimson glow on the horizon. He saw the faces of the colonists, the engineers, the families in the settlement. They were oblivious, going about their lives, trusting in the authority that was about to annihilate them. They were complicit in Lyra's torture, yes, but they were also victims of Valerius's greed. He could not let them all perish for the sins of one man. Running was no longer an option. Hiding was pointless. The entire world was the blast radius. A direct assault was equally impossible. Valerius would have the entire remaining security force locked down around the complex. They were two fugitives against a fortress on the verge of self-destruction. It was an unwinnable war. He sat beside Lyra's weakened form, the ground shaking more violently now. He felt a profound sense of despair. He had failed. He had freed her from her prison only to lead her to a different kind of death, and he had doomed the very people he had tried to leave behind. It was then that she showed him the last resort, the final, terrible solution. The vision she projected into his mind was clear and precise. The reactor could not be shut down. The connection to the planet's core was severed, but the wound remained, gushing raw energy. It was like an arterial bleed. It couldn't be stitched, only cauterized. The machine had to be given a new heart, a new regulator. Someone had to go into the core chamber, into the raging storm of raw power, and take her place. But not just to die. They had to consciously merge with the Nexus, to become a living conduit, a bridge between the machine and the planet. They would have to absorb the overload, ground the excess energy, and impose order on the chaos through sheer force of will. It was an act of ultimate sacrifice. It would mean the dissolution of the physical body, the subsumption of the individual consciousness into the planet's energy field. The person would cease to exist, becoming instead a silent, eternal guardian. A living seal. The vision ended. Cale was left staring into Lyra's faint light, the impossible choice hanging between them in the sulphurous air. She was too weak to do it herself. Her connection was too damaged. and it was not her place. The wound had been made by humanity. It had to be healed by a human. She was asking him to die. No, she was asking him to become something else entirely. To sacrifice not just his life, but his very self, his identity, his memories, everything that made him Kalen. The cost was absolute, but the prize was the survival of a world. The ground shuddered violently, throwing him against the rock wall. The red glow on the horizon intensified, pulsing like a malevolent beacon. Time was running out. The silence in the geothermal fissure was broken only by the hiss of steam and the distant, angry rumble of the dying planet. Kale sat with his back against the warm rock, the impossible choice weighing on him with a physical pressure. He looked at his hands, calloused and stained with the red dirt of Ethel. These hands had held weapons, repaired engines, and tilled the soil. They were the hands of a man who had lived a life, a hard life, but his own. The thought of them, of his entire physical being, dissolving into a storm of raw energy was a visceral, primal horror. He had come to this world to be forgotten. He had built a wall of solitude around himself, a quiet penance for the things he had done in the war. He had wanted nothing more than to watch his crops grow and be left alone until his time was done. To trade that quiet, anonymous end for a spectacular, sacrificial dissolution felt like a cruel joke. Why him? Why should he pay the price for Valerius's ambition, for a century of corporate greed? He looked over at Lyra. Her light was a pale, fragile flicker in the gloom, her energy almost completely spent in showing him the way. She was dying, and her world was dying with her. She had trusted him, a creature of the species that had imprisoned and tortured her. She had followed him into this wasteland, protected him, shown him the truth. In the short time he had known her, she had shown him more loyalty and honor than any commanding officer he had ever served. He thought of his past, of the orders he had followed on Cygnus X-1, the strategic bombardment of a civilian sector to root out a handful of insurgents. He still saw the faces of the dead in his nightmares, the ones he had been assured were acceptable collateral damage. He had followed protocol then, done his duty, and a part of his soul had withered and died. He had become a farmer on Ethel to escape that ghost, to try and nurture life instead of enabling its destruction. Was this any different? If he walked away now, if he let the colony die, he would be making the same choice he made on Cygnus. He would be following the protocol of self-preservation, and the collateral damage would be an entire world. His past had followed him here, across light years of space, to present him with one final, terrible test. This time, he would not be following an order. The choice would be his alone. To die as a man, or to live forever as a memory. To fade away in obscurity on his 10-acre plot, or to become something more, a silent guardian who ensured that life could continue. It was not a choice between life and death. It was a choice about what his life and his death would ultimately mean. He took a long, slow breath, the sulfuric air searing his lungs. The trembling of the earth was constant now. He knew there were only hours, maybe minutes, left. The internal debate was over. There was no rage, no fear, only a strange, cold clarity. A sense of profound, weary acceptance. He pushed himself to his feet and walked over to Lyra. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her faint light. He reached out, not to touch her, as she had no physical form, but as a gesture, a promise. He didn't need words. He focused his thoughts, his decision, and sent it to her through their bond. It was a simple, unadorned message, I will do it. Her light pulsed, a soft, warm wave of gratitude and immense sorrow. She showed him an image, his own face, not as it was now, grizzled and weary, but younger, the face of the soldier he had been, and then the face dissolved into a starfield. It was her way of saying she understood what he was giving up. She knew the cost. He stood up and looked back toward the crimson stain in the sky. His expression was set, his purpose clear. He was no longer a farmer, no longer a fugitive. He was a man walking toward his destiny. All right, he said, his voice a low rasp in the darkness. Let's go back. Lyra's light strengthened, drawing on his resolve. She gathered her remaining energy and rose, a small, determined golden sphere. Together, they turned their backs on the wilderness and began the final journey back to the heart of the storm. They traveled with a desperate speed, guided by Lyra's senses. She found the shortest path, leading him through canyons and over ridges, a direct line to the dying reactor. The world around them was coming apart. The ground split open in deep fissures that vented scalding steam. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a static that made the hairs on Kale's arms stand on end. The red glow from the colony was no longer on the horizon. It filled the entire sky before them, a pulsating dome of apocalyptic light. They reached the outskirts of the reactor complex to find it in chaos. The perimeter fences were down, torn apart by the seismic upheavals. The security forces were in disarray, some trying to form a defensive line, others fleeing in blind panic. Kale and Lyra slipped through the confusion, a ghost and a flicker of light moving through a nightmare. The main entrance was blocked by rubble. Kale led them to the maintenance duct they had used to escape, its heavy door buckled but still passable. Inside, the emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows. The klaxons were gone, replaced by the deafening shriek of tearing metal and the roar of escaping plasma. They fought their way upward, level by level, through the guts of the dying machine. They encountered pockets of guards, loyal or foolish enough to have remained at their posts. Kale moved with the lethal efficiency of his past life. He was not a farmer anymore. He was a combat engineer, and this was his battlefield. He used the environment, shorting panels to create distractions, dropping heavy conduits to block passages. His knowledge of the facility's layout giving him an advantage the panicked soldiers did not have. Lyra aided him, her weakened light just enough to create blinding flashes or short out the guards' comms, adding to the confusion. They finally reached the command level. The observation room's plasteel window was cracked, the immense pressure from the core threatening to shatter it. Inside, Governor Valerius stood before the main console, his immaculate suit now disheveled, his face pale with sweat. He was frantically trying to input commands into a system that was no longer responding. Commander Thorne was there too, his pristine uniform torn, a nasty burn mark on his cheek. He stood guard over the governor, his pulse rifle aimed at the door. As Kale burst into the room, Thorne reacted instantly, firing a volley of pulse rounds. Kale dove behind a bank of servers, the shots sizzling through the air where he had been. "You!" Valerius shrieked, his voice thin and hysterical. "You did this. You and that thing. You've destroyed us all. You did this to yourself." Kale yelled back over the roar of the dying core. He could see the main gantry, the path to the core chamber, just beyond them. "You were too greedy to see what you were destroying." He signaled to Lyra. She flared, a sudden, brilliant flash of light that momentarily blinded the two men. In that instant, Kale broke from cover. He charged not at Thorne, but at a conduit carrying coolant for the server bank. He ripped it open with his bare hands, and supercooled gas flooded the area between him and the commander. Thorne fired blindly into the thick, white mist. Kale was already past him. He tackled Valerius, sending them both crashing to the floor. The governor was surprisingly strong, fueled by panic, but Kale was driven by something more. He slammed Valerius's head against the deck, stunning him, then scrambled to his feet. Thorne, his vision clearing, turned, his face a mask of pure hatred. "I'll see you in hell, farmer," he roared, raising his rifle for a final, point-blank shot. Before he could fire, a wisp of golden light shot from Lyra and wrapped around the rifle's barrel. The weapon instantly superheated, glowing cherry red. Thorne cried out in agony, dropping the molten rifle as his hands were seared. It was the last of Lyra's strength. Her light faded to a barely visible speck. Kale didn't hesitate. He ran for the airlock to the core chamber. "Stop!" Valerius screamed, staggering to his feet. "You can't. It's unstable. You'll be vaporized." Kale paused at the door, his hand on the manual release. He looked back at the man who had caused all of this, a man so blinded by his own ambition he couldn't comprehend an act that wasn't for personal gain. There was nothing to say. He offered only a final, pitying glance, then turned and cycled the airlock. He stepped out onto the gantry. The heat was a physical blow, 1,000 times worse than before. The air itself was incandescent plasma. The radiation suit would have melted in seconds. He was unprotected, just a man in a torn and bloody jumpsuit. The core was no longer a contained nexus of light, but a raging, uncontrolled star, a miniature sun of pure, white-hot chaos. This was the end of the path. He felt the last of Lyra's consciousness merge with his, a final, grateful farewell. He was alone now. He took a step, then another, walking into the heart of the inferno. The pain was absolute, a fire that consumed every nerve in his body simultaneously. His skin blackened and peeled away. His muscles vaporized. His bones turned to ash. His physical form was annihilated in less than a second. But his consciousness, shielded for a moment by the echo of Lyra's presence, endured. He pushed through the pain, reaching for the raw, screaming heart of the Nexus. He grasped it, not with hands, but with his will. He poured his memories, his regrets, his pain, his newfound purpose, everything that was Kalen, into the storm. He became the order in the chaos. He became the conduit. He felt his awareness expand, shattering the confines of his own skull. He was the reactor. He was the mountain it was built on. He was the sky, the dust, the planet. He was Ethel. And then there was peace. In the control room, the transformation was instantaneous and profound. The violent, world-ending roar of the overloading core ceased. The floor stopped shaking. The blinding white light from the cracked observation window softened, shifting through a spectrum of colors, angry red, then orange, yellow, green, and finally settling into a calm, steady, brilliant blue. Every alarm in the complex fell silent at once. The screaming shriek of tearing metal was replaced by a gentle, resonant hum, the sound of immense power in perfect, serene balance. Valerius and the wounded Thorn stared, mouths agape, at the impossible calm. The hostile red lights on the control panels had all turned to a soft, reassuring blue. The energy output gauge, which had been fluctuating wildly in the red, now rested at a solid, unwavering 100%. The war was over. The crisis was averted. But the farmer was gone. 10 years passed. The colony on Ethel survived. It did more than survive. It thrived. Governor Valerius was gone, recalled by the corporation and tried for gross negligence and crimes against a sentient species, a charge made possible by the reactor's logs, which had been mysteriously and completely restored after the incident. Commander Thorn vanished, rumored to have taken his own life rather than face tribunal. The Ethel Corporation's charter was revoked. The colony was granted independence, governed now by a council of its own people. They learned the truth of what powered their world, not from a corporate manual, but from a growing, collective intuition. They learned to live in symbiosis with the planet, not as masters, but as partners. The energy was limitless, clean, and freely given. The once barren world began to change. Faint green patches of native flora, unseen for a century, began to emerge from the red dust. The air grew sweeter. The reactor complex still stood, but it was no longer a place of industry. It was a sanctuary. The control room had been turned into a quiet space for reflection. The cracked plasteel window had never been replaced. It served as a reminder. An old man stood before the window, looking down into the core. It was Arden, the former chief engineer, now a respected elder on the colony council. The core chamber was no longer a sterile, mechanical cage. It glowed with a soft, living, blue light that pulsed with the gentle rhythm of a sleeping heart. They didn't call it the reactor anymore. They called it the heart of Ethel. Arden looked at the light, a silent communion he performed every year on the anniversary of the Great Silence, the day the alarms had stopped. He felt the same thing he always did, a sense of profound peace, of a watchful presence, a benevolent consciousness that permeated the entire colony. A silent guardian. On the wall beside the window, where the emergency protocols used to be displayed, there was now a simple bronze plaque. It did not list a rank or a serial number. It did not speak of heroics or sacrifice. It bore only 2 words, etched in plain, simple lettering. Kalen, the farmer. His sacrifice was not forgotten. It was revered, not as the grand gesture of a soldier, but as the quiet, nurturing act of a man who had, in the end, chosen to plant a seed of peace that would flourish for generations. The legacy of the man who had wanted only to be left alone was a world brought together in harmony, powered by the steady, enduring beat of his transformed heart. The dust still blew across the red plains of Ethel, but now, it tasted of hope.